light in there? Height. All right, so I'm going to be reading chapter 10 today. Apologies for the delay, but as you probably have heard, the third book, First Draft, is done, which is huge. That ended up eating up most of my day on Sunday when I intended to do the last live read, but unfortunately, I just was so close to being finished that I wanted to make sure that I actually did get it done. So the third book is done. If you're curious what that means for going forward is now I have to go through an editing and revising process that could take 6 months. It could take 3 months. It's hard to say. And the first few revisions will all be contextual and tone and storytelling and things like that. And then the more heavy-duty edits will start happening after that. And then it becomes more of a tweaking and fine-tuning. So I'm still shooting for next spring releasing the third book. So if you're curious, there's the heads up there. I'll post some of that info to Twitter and Facebook as well for people to see. So we're going to do chapter 10. This is going to take place entirely at Twisted Spire. I don't believe there's a lot of breaks in this one, so bear with me. When Valroth came to retrieve Azariel for his treatment, the master of the tower was irritated to find the prisoners still alive. Nevertheless, he brought his prize out of the cage and, with little prodding, led him through a number of bizarre and maddening chambers full of alien items and creatures. The procedure went more smoothly than previous efforts, and Valroth knew he was getting close to completion of his exceptional task. Then, as they were passing the pens of rare and vile beings, Azariel lashed out so suddenly and terribly that Valroth was unable to halt him before he fed on 2 black-furred large cats, brought all the way from Westia many years ago. Irritated as he was to lose 2 of his prizes, Valroth was encouraged by the viciousness of his creation and assumed his lust for blood had increased. When he brought him back to the cell, he smiled at the others who had dared to provoke him by searching his tower, and left them all in the darkness to face the inevitable. Azariel retreated immediately to his corner of their shared prison. Raymer was asleep, but Edge was awake and alert with desperation. He whispered across the room, "Were you able to get what you needed? To help us, I mean." There was a long pause and a wheezing response. "Yes, but I need her. You've no gift for the arcane, and she does. I'll have to pass my strength through her to avoid the feedback from Valroth's wards." Edge felt in the back of his skull a terrible doubt creeping in. He stifled it and spoke once more to the being in the darkness. "What is it you want of us? If you've no power here, what can we hope to do against the master of this place? He possesses an item that restrains me, preventing my escape and revenge against the being that has tormented me. Valroth has imbued me with a great pool of the arcane to be channeled and directed by his hand. If you can find the seal that holds me to his will and destroy it, I can do the rest." Edge was quietly in thought before asking, "If you can use Raymer to evade the wards, why not destroy Valroth then, if it's within your abilities?" A hissing intake of breath met Edge's question. To be so close to her for too long, I would not be able to contain it. The fear came back in Edge's mind. Contain what? What's it that Valroth has done to you? There was a long unbroken silence, then a sudden swish of cloth and tapping of feet, and Azariel was suddenly inches from Edge's face. The lost elf had not caught even a glimpse of their fellow prisoner before, and now Azariel was there. Edge stared into his horrid visage with ferocious, blood-tinged eyes that stood out from frighteningly pale skin. There was no hair on Azariel's head, and his facial bones were clearly visible just beneath his flesh. Bared teeth, more like fangs, could have torn Edge apart, but Azariel had restraint. Azariel crouched on his heels in dirty rags and slowly retreated until he was lost in darkness again. Edge finally exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath all that time. The voice came from the black, once more, somewhat extinguished of the madness Edge had seen in the figure before him moments earlier. "That is what he has done. He has unmade whatever I was before through experiments. But there exists something else beneath the manipulation I cannot touch, nor not while he controls me. Help me get free, and I'll send you on your way, safely." A realization came to Edge then, but he wisely kept it to himself. They were trapped here as much as he wished it could be otherwise. He did not have the power to free he and Raymer alone. "All right, I'll wake her. We should begin soon, while you still have control." Raymer came too quickly, confusion soon giving way to fear mingled with determination. She heard the shifting in the darkness, and Azariel's voice came toward them both softly. "I'll have to touch you to make it work. Stay, and do not be afraid." This time the horrid figure came slowly towards them both. Raymer gave a sharp intake of breath as his death-like face was exposed, but she held his eyes stoically. Halting a short distance from them both, Azariel crouched and took a number of slow, steady breaths. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly. "I will pass my arcane abilities through you, and channel enough to unspool the protections on the door. It will take time. Breaking the lock or wards would alert Valroth. I have to be precise." "Can I do anything to help?" "Yes." Azariel opened his eyes and met Raymer's own. "You must hold on to yourself. Such a transfer of arcane energy is dangerous, even given your natural affinity that I could sense as you arrived. If you do not remain centered, you may unravel." Edge interrupted then. "What does that mean, unravel?" It was Raymir who answered him. The manipulation of the arcane is the use of the gods' language, which destroyed many of the first mortals, but it did more than kill them. It erased them from existence. If she fails to hold on, Azariel said quietly, the magic may do the same to her. Then there has to be another way. Edge tugged on his chains in anger. I won't let you do this, Raymir. There is no other way, Azariel said, his own voice growing tight with barely contained fury. If you do not break loose, you will die. Valroth will not let me spare you, and I will have no choice. Do it, Raymir said, extending her hand as far as the chains on the wall allowed. Edge was about to protest, but Azariel came forward and, with remarkable gentleness, took her hand in his. His eyes flushed a bit redder as he felt the blood in her veins pulsating, but he closed them and sought the magic that had been fused into him by Valroth. Slowly, but with steadily increasing urgency, he poured his might into her. Raymir gasped as it flowed through the connection and saw her focus. Azariel reached deeper and deeper, seeking every scrap of power he might have had, and sending it through her veins. The strength of it made her feel as though she were drowning slowly, and she clung to everything she could that made her aware of the world about her. Azariel began to send out through Raymir the arcane waves he had poured into her. He could feel the wards, the tumblers, and the locks, the pulsations of magic all around the cell. He focused on the wards first, undoing one slowly, then, as he came to understand their making, faster and faster. Raymir, still feeling as though she was being pulled under, but now in a river rather than a pool, was stretched and also receiving lashing waves of pain from the wards as Azariel worked on them. She gritted her teeth, though her eyes had rolled back into her head and she saw nothing. She could sense the whole world around dissolving. Trying to remember Azariel's warning, she pressed the image of the cell, the mortal world, into her mind. The pain came through stronger then, immense, sudden, and all-encompassing. She cried out in a long, unending shriek of fear and hurt. Edge roared in distress as well, helpless. Azariel ignored them both. He released the locks on the door, the last wards coming free as twisting, as his own control began to slip. At the last desperate lunge of his magic, he broke the metal bonds on the two. His eyes snapped open, completely flushed with blood, and he released Raymir, scuttling backwards on his hands and knees to the far wall. Edge, freed of the shackles, caught her as she fell, desperately checking a pulse. Go, howled Azariel. Get her from here. I can't contain it any longer. Edge shoved the door open and pulled Raymir through. He heard the rush of movement in the room he had vacated and spun, more instinctively than intentionally, slamming the door shut, turning the lock. He fell backwards as Azariel struck the metal so forcefully that it bent under his charge, but thankfully it did not break. The figure was no longer even a mockery of a man, but a beast. Clawed hands stretched and scraped forward, tearing at stone in desperate lunges for Edge. The lost elf looked at him, recognizing that there was nothing there that could help them any more. This was the monster he was supposed to release. This was the being that was going to help them. He turned his eyes away, trying to ignore the animalistic snarls of Azariel, and lifted Raymir in his arms. Turning for the stairs, he stumbled up them in the dark and pushed open the door. The next room was lit faintly by torches, and Edge set Raymir down before closing the door behind him. He stood there, looking about him and wondering how they were ever going to find their way out through the maze of the tower. Then he knelt by Raymir's side, checked her breathing and pulse. They were both slow, steady, and strong. He dared not wake her, but he also knew he had to make haste in exploring their surroundings. Who knew how long they had been before Valroth discovered they had escaped? Edge hesitated for some time, then he stood and, with a few nervous looks over his shoulder, started down the hall to the left of the stairs, seeking some way to continue the climb. Raymir was awash in her unconscious mind, drained by the channeling of so much magical power from Azariel and the sense of how close she had come to unraveling and being consumed by the arcane. Through the chaos, she heard Azariel's voice, as if it could be called that, insistent and commanding. Get up. Her eyes flew open, and she was resting against stone walls of a dark and forbidding tower. Azariel's sending came with an almost palpable sense of pain. Not the sharp, tearing sensation the wards had assaulted her with, but a dull, aching hunger that haunted his echoing message. Raymir could not see or hear Edge, but she heard many other horrors from every corner of the shadows. The voice echoed in her mind once more. To the right. Second door. Raymir rose feebly, and leaning one hand on the dark wall, shuffled down the corridor. She passed the first door and was grateful, for it had a horrible twisted face etched in a scream of eternal suffering. The second was a simple wooden door bound in metal bolts. She leaned on it, and it swung open without resistance, causing her to nearly fall forward. The hinges made no noise, and a crescent torch on the wall gave a strong light to the room. She wondered now for the first time if there were any windows in this wretched tower. The light, however, revealed something that raised her spirits. Edge's halberd was leaning on a pile of other weapons and more mundane implements. Her elation in its recovery was quickly doused by the horror in realizing what so many items, bereft of their owners, implied. Pushing the idea out of her mind, she searched for her sword, but the voice in the back of her mind, which she now knew must be Azariel's, fought her. She turned to the wall of the small chamber and saw a rack of carven poles set there. Stepping forward, she recognized a few staves, the prized tool of mighty wizards. Reaching towards them, she saw one glow of faint greenish blue as her hand neared. She wrapped her fingers around the haft, and nothing had felt more comfortable to her in all her life. A hand on her shoulder brought her whirling round, lashing out with her new prize. Edge was just able to duck out of the way, and Raymer put a hand to her mouth in horror, but who soon was stifling a laugh. "Oh, Edge, I'm so sorry. You startled me." "It was my fault. I was just worried you had wandered off." Lostoff spotted his halberd and walked over to pick it up, noting that cloak and armor were also tossed in a pile of similar articles. He began dressing himself, then paused as he was binding his cloak clasps. "How did you know this was here?" Raymer was not sure how to explain, so she simply told him what she believed was going on. "I think Azariel is in my head in some way. I heard him tell me to go in this room." "Well, it worked in our favor this time, but we should be cautious. I don't trust him, Raymer." "He got us out, didn't he? We don't really have any choice." Edge knew she was right, but it did not make him any more pleased about the situation. He felt a bit more himself with his equipment returned to him, but his brief journey into the dark had left him shaken. There were things in this place he did not think his skills would be of any use against, and that doubt was beginning to overwhelm his bravery and determination to stop Valroth. If he were being honest with himself, he would have preferred to take flight before trying to confront the fearsome master of the tower. Raymer would never have accepted that line of thinking. Azariel's voice resounded in her mind again, once more commanding and asserting rather than coaxing. "He will be of no use here. The mysteries of this place are only of the arcane and other things older still. You must lead, to Valros Astrolabe, at the very apex of the tower. I have been there once, and only once, but I know it is where he is for most of his work. If you can, you should find the other prisoner, but I do not know where he is being kept or if he will be of help to you." Edge was watching Raymer, and when she came out of her trance-like state of concentration, he seemed aware of what had transpired. In a resigned tone, he asked, "What does he suggest we do?" "He says there's another prisoner here, but doesn't know where. Apparently we're most likely to find Valroth in the Astrolabe at the top of the tower." Edge grimaced. "I was hoping we could catch him unawares, asleep in his chamber, or even avoid him altogether. I'm not sure that whatever Valroth needs is sleep." They said nothing more and prepared to leave. Raymer searched for a few crates for potions that might be useful, finding one that she drank immediately, which promised to increase her stamina and focus. She felt a delightful warmth in her chest and stomach, and a bit more refreshed than when she had been forcibly woken by Azariel's demanding voice, and together they stepped out of the small storage room. Edge took the crescent torch from the wall and held it over his head, noting to his surprise how low the ceilings were. "Did our friend offer any ideas of how to reach the top quickly? Valroth must be able to move through this place almost at will, but we're a bit blind here. Other than looking for the stairs, I'm not certain what we should do." The two of them wandered about cautiously for some time. The windowless building was only occasionally lit by torches, so edges proved more invaluable to their search. The lack of outside light made it impossible to tell the time of day or night, or indeed how much time had passed since they were freed of the cell. Raymer received no further instructions from Azariel, and she suspected he'd either exhausted himself or they had moved outside his range of communication. Despite the bleak emptiness of the tower, rooms with bare, sleek walls of glassy stone, and hallways unadorned with decoration of any kind, there were constant noises of all sorts. Edge had to keep his mind on the search, where the unearthly sounds would have driven him cowering to a corner. Raymer seemed far more resistant to the tower's foulness. Whether it was Azariel's encouragement, or she was actually more powerful here than her beloved, she was soon the one leading the hunt for the path to the Astrolabe. Stairs were discovered, but they were a nest of spirals and splitting forks that led up and down in all directions. The disorienting effects of the tower meant that within an hour they were completely unsure of where they were in relation to their cell, and Raymer could have believed they were 10 floors above or below where they'd begun. After another hour of desperate attempts to climb higher and higher, they reached a balcony that ended in nothing more than a blank wall, and a bench that appeared made of the same stone as the floor. Edge seated himself, hands going to his head as he tried to push out the scraping, sliding, shrieking sounds around him. Raymer seemed unfazed, standing and staring in frustration at the dead end before saying, "We can wait a moment, but we have to keep moving. Valroth will notice we're missing before long, and when he does, we won't have much chance against him in his home." Edge steeled himself and straightened, but he took a moment before standing. Raymer was still staring at the wall, and she moved closer to it, her hand extended slightly. "What is it?" Edge asked. Rather than answer him, Raymer traced a pattern on the singular block of stone with her finger, and to Edge's shock, where she passed over the wall, a glowing line appeared. When she finished, the symbol flared to blinding levels, and then the wall was simply gone. Edge stepped next to her and whispered, "Did Azariel tell you that?" "No," Raymer answered him. "I just saw the pattern." Without further explanation, she stepped forward. They were in a wide hallway, 15 feet or more across, with a door facing them that appeared no different than any other they had passed from the tower. Edge was more cautious than Raymer, standing a bit farther back. The young small woman approached the door and studied it carefully. If there was an illusion guarding this door, it might be dangerous. "I was thinking the same thing," Raymer agreed, "but Valroth may also have noticed the illusion being removed. We can't hesitate." Without further discussion, she grasped the knob and opened the door. There was no trap or spell triggered that they could detect, and after a pause of a few moments, Raymer stepped into the chamber. Edge hurried behind her, watching their backs, and once he was inside, he closed the door and slid the crossbolt into place. As he moved from the door to see what they'd found, he almost collided with Raymer, who had barely moved from the entrance. Before her, suspended by a considerable number of long tubes filled with unidentified fluids, was a man. He was clad in ragged clothes, not dissimilar to what Azariel had left to him, and he appeared quite old. His gray hair hung over his face, such that they could not see precisely what he looked like, and his beard went down past his waist, though his head was bent, and perhaps it would not have been so lengthy if he were able to stand. But he was not standing, of course. There was a large and fearsome-looking metal pole with several more attached horizontally across it that the man was bound to. The metal was sharp and had many hooks and edges to it, with the long stretches of what must have been animal intestine piping woven among the metal and the figure. However, the man was dwarfed by the immense glass containers all around him, bubbling and steaming with unrecognizable liquids of all colors. Some glowed faintly, others were dark and viscous, and still more seemed to shift impossibly as though they were alive. Raymer was transfixed by the sight, and Edge felt his gorge rise in his stomach and struggled to keep from vomiting. "What new horror is this?" the lost elf said quietly. Raymer did not answer him. She knelt before the old man and examined several vials with spidery labels on them that were arrayed neatly on the floor in front of the small platform on which his metal support sat. The writing was in the language of the gods, the arcane, and Raymer found she could only identify some of it. A wooden box to the right of the vials held more tubing and syringes, as well as viciously sharp needles of varying lengths. Raymer looked up and studied the body more closely, realizing that every appendage had something thrust into it, draining whatever it could from the man trapped there. Other piping high above seemed to be providing water and other necessities to keep him alive, though it was unclear how effective it had been. Edge came to the same realization as Raymer did, and his voice carried a noted strain of fury. Who would do this to another man? Tormenting them for what? "I think," Raymer said softly, "this is what Valroth has been feeding Azariel. The very essence of this man, whoever he is. Is he alive?" Raymer watched the faint movement of the beard and shallow breaths coming and going. "Yes, barely." Edge felt torn, his eyes darting back the way they'd come. "Should we free him? Do we have time?" "I think he's the prisoner Azariel told me about. He said if we found him we should release him." Raymer shook her head sadly. "Though I wonder if he's in any condition to be freed, or to help us." "Well, I can't leave him here." Edge stepped forward, his hands on one of the metal syringes attached to the wide tubes filling the tanks about the room. He looked down at Raymer. "If I get him off this thing, can you at least stop him from bleeding out?" Raymer nodded, and Edge began the horrific process of dislodging the man from the contraption to which he was bound. As he began to pull the needles loose, the old man woke and babbled incomprehensibly in a number of languages, at last uttering a few things that Raymer and Edge were able to recognize. "End of it. Die once or die forever. What's the choice? Can't be born. Can't be born." The rest was impossible to understand. Edge tried to work quickly, but he also did not want to injure the prisoner. Eventually he removed the last needle and lifted him bodily from the rack he was hanging from by frayed ropes, smashing the thin chains that held his wrists and ankles. Setting him on the ground, he stepped back as Raymer placed her hands on his head and whispered the arcane healing spells she could recall. The rivulets of blood dried up, the man's eyes fluttered open, consciousness seemingly restored, but madness and suffering were still stamped across his face. The two would-be rescuers stepped back. The man eased himself to a sitting position, blinking rapidly for some time, his mouth opened in surprise. Raymer had been waiting for him to pass out once more, or slump over dead, but he seemed remarkably well despite his emaciated and crazed appearance. "Thane Engathar, is that you?" Edge looked at Raymer in confusion, then shook his head. "This must be Yarth. Am I in Everwinter? It's dark enough." Raymer's eyes widened slightly, and she whispered to Edge, "He's talking about Yarth and Everwinter and Engathar?" She crouched low and gave a disarming smile. "I'm sorry, are you talking about Engathar the Mad?" The old man looked at her in confusion for some time. Then he burst into echoing guffaws of laughter. He convulsed and bent over, his mirth apparently unending, and Edge was looking about in a panic, certain they would be discovered. The old man finally was able to speak through his hilarity and said, "Mad, mad, mad. Haha, yes. Grist." He stood triumphantly and raised his thin arms over his head in celebration. "Grist. Thank you, I remember. Grist." Raymer sensed Edge's growing alarm and grasped the man by the shoulders. "Please, you have to be quiet. We're still trapped in the tower. Do you remember that, Twisted Spire?" The old man met her eyes and lowered his arms slowly. "I remember. Valroth, servant to the other." He glanced about the room, as if seeing it for the first time. "I've been here a long while, but I am still me, still Grist." Edge was certain the man was completely insane and began nudging Raymer. "We should move on. We've lingered too long." "I'm not leaving him here." Raymer turned to the old man. "We need to leave. Can you come with us?" "Leave? Where do you want to go?" Edge stepped forward. "We're trying to get to the Astrolab to stop Valroth. Do you know where that is?" The old man looked at them both, his eyes darting back and forth, and he shook his head vigorously. No. Not safe for you. Too close to him. Below the top. A room. Smaller. Safer. We will go there." "But we need to reach the top," Edge insisted. "We can't get out unless we do." "Not yet," the old man said sternly. Then he grabbed both of their wrists and gave each a wide grin. "Hang on." It was as though they had blinked and suddenly were somewhere else. Raymer was looking at both Edge and the old man, then they were gone, and back again in a flash, but she knew they'd moved somehow. Edge felt the same sudden relocation, as though they had set, as though, and as they settled in the place they'd traveled to, a wave of nausea swept over them both. Edge doubled over and vomited, thankfully not much, as he hadn't eaten recently. Raymer was able to contain herself, but only barely. She was still bent over, leaning on the wall for balance. The old man was instead squatting on the floor, a small piece of chalk in his hand, sketching a wavy symbol there. Raymer was about to ask what he was doing when he held up his finger to his lips for quiet. Edge, seeing the gesture, tried to calm his groans and hoped his moment of weakness had not made too much noise. The old man finished his work and waved one hand over the rune, which gave off a faint hum as he did. Satisfied, he looked at Raymer and grinned. "You can talk now. They won't hear. He won't hear." "Who?" "Valroth," the man answered, and he pointed one thin finger up at the ceiling. Edge stepped forward and exhaled in shock. There was a trapdoor just over their heads, and if they could believe their new ally, it led to the astrolabe. Raymer studied the drawing on the floor. "It's a rune of silence," she explained to Edge. "Keeps sound from escaping the room." She stared at the old man, now certain that there was far more to him than even his incredible feats suggested. "Who are you?" The old man shrugged. "Grist." Edge looked at him in confusion and then at Raymer. "Isn't Grist the god of madness?" The old man smiled widely and pointed at Edge in agreement, clapping his hands afterward. "So he's a priest of his, then?" "Not a priest, not a priest," the old man cried, placing his hands on his chest. "Grist." Raymer and Edge stared at one another. "He thinks he's the god of madness," she said. "I think he's just crazy." The old man, or Grist, since apparently that was all he would answer to, crossed his arms and glowered at them. "I am not a priest, I am Grist. Mad, mad Grist. Came to Tethsnir and was left behind. Left behind." Raymer tried to appease the old man. All right. Sorry, Grist. It's just hard to believe a god would be here with us. Hasn't happened in ages." "Since Imorbellum," Grist said solemnly. "Since she killed them." Edge was puzzled. "She? Killed who?" "Killed Naratha. Killed Sheatha. Bad days. Dark days." Raymer put a hand on Grist's bony wrist. "You mean someone killed gods? Who could do that?" Grist looked at her and shrugged. "Another god." Edge became exasperated. "This is getting us nowhere. We need to stop Valroth, to find this token of his that keeps Azariel locked up down there and free him." He stopped then and turned to Raymer. "Are we sure we should do that? You didn't see what he was like, Raymer, when you passed out. He's a monster. I don't know if he's any better than Valroth." Raymer glared at Edge. "He helped us. I'm not leaving him trapped there. Anyway, how else do you propose we leave?" Edge had to concede there was no alternative. Grist was now wandering about the room, which seemed to be a small storage space with crates and barrels, all sealed and gathering dust. The old man was tapping at each one as though assessing their contents in that way, and Edge had an idea. "Raymer, I know you want to help Azariel, but Grist here just teleported us right where we wanted to be. Who's to say he couldn't just bring us out of the tower?" "Can't," Grist answered without turning around. "Too strong." "What's too strong, Grist?" Raymer asked. "The tower? Valroth?" "The beyond," Grist hissed, and his feeble shoulders shuddered as he spoke. Edge and Raymer exchanged looks of confusion, but they chose not to press their new companion further. Grist spun from the barrels and moved suddenly towards Raymer. Before Edge could intercede, he thrust his palm against her forehead and whispered, "See." Raymer's head snapped back and her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She remained that way for a few seconds, and just as Edge was grabbing Grist and trying to shove him off her, she came out of it and stumbled backward, catching herself on the wall. Forgetting his anger, Edge hurried to her, but she pushed him away. Grist was now on the far end of the room again, shrinking himself in a corner and muttering, "Too strong, too strong." Raymer got control of herself, and her eyes drifted upward, as though she could see through the ceiling into the astrolabe above. Edge could sense her fear. "What is it?" "I saw it. The beyond." "What is it?" Raymer could not find the words and passed her hand over her eyes, shaking her head. "Couldn't explain it if I tried. But that's who Valroth serves. Not the gods, not mortals, something else." "But Daeron's notes were about a weapon being made here," Edge said. "And you thought he was working with someone to help the Nerathians, to aid Wolfbane." Raymer shook her head, trying to jar loose the dark images floating in it. "I'm not certain of anything anymore. Grist," she looked over Edge's shoulder at the figure huddled in the corner, "was brought here and experimented on by Valroth. He's been giving his essence to Azariel, along with some other bizarre materials, to turn Azariel into some sort of immortal vessel of unlimited power. Not just the arcane, not just in physicality, but something more than all of it combined." "So Azariel's the weapon," Edge breathed. "That's what they are making here." "It seems so," Raymer said, "which means Grist really is who he says he is. Otherwise, why go to the trouble of attaching him to that thing? What else could possibly be strong enough to remake a mortal but the very essence of a god?" "But how did Grist get here? How did Valroth even find him?" Edge shook his head in frustration. "None of this makes sense." "It doesn't, but that's what he showed me." Raymer walked over to Grist and put a hand gently on his shoulder. The old man jumped in fear and spun, but relaxed when he saw it was her. "Grist, can we stop Valroth? Is there a way?" The old man stared at her for a long time before nodding. Will you help us? Chris looked at Edge, then at her, then nodded again. Good, Raymer smiled. So what do we need to do? That is chapter 10. I'll be back on Sunday with chapter 11, and possibly in between I'll try to get another extra chapter up in there. Thanks for listening. As always, you can follow me on @Legacy Chronicle on Twitter or the Legacy Chronicle Facebook page. I'll have more updates on what's going on with Book 3 now that the draft is done, and hopefully you can figure out from there a rough timeline of what's going to be happening. Thanks.